Welcome back. We're going to continue on with our brain anatomy here, and if we're moving on down our list from the study guide, next thing we were going to cover were the cerebral cortex and the cerebral medulla. And so I've actually brought up rather than using visible body for a minute, I have brought up a diagram from your textbook, and so here's a brain over here, obviously, and we're looking at a coronal section through the brain. Okay, so we're looking at a coronal section through the brain. Now, if you notice here on the diagram, at the superficial portions of the cerebrum, all along, I got my pen on, all along in through here, up and down over those gyri, down into the sulci and so forth. You've got the darker areas in there. Those areas consist of gray matter, and over here you're actually looking at a coronal section through a real human brain, so you can see that those superficial areas are a little bit darker. So that those superficial areas, that's called the cerebral cortex, and that consists of gray matter. All right, and the reason it has that grayish color is because the cell bodies of the billions and billions and billions of neurons that are located in the cerebral cortex and are responsible for many of the things that make us human are located there. So where you have cell bodies, you will have gray matter. Now, if you notice deeper inside the brain, notice that a lot of the tissues are whitish in color, and that's true over here as well on the picture of the actual brain. And those deeper areas are called the cerebral medulla. And you guys are going to hear cortex and medulla more than once in your A&P classes. So there are glands that have a cortex and a medulla, and the cortex is going to be the more superficial areas. The medulla will be the interior, deeper, central areas. So you'll hear those terms used more than once. And the cerebral medulla consists mostly of white matter. You guys have heard of gray matter and white matter before. White matter, the reason you have that whitish coloration is because in there you mainly have myelinated axons of neurons. And that's what they're showing you over here in this diagram from your textbook. You see all these fibers that you have in here that are colored in. Those are areas where you have tons and tons and tons and tons of myelinated axons of neurons. Some of those axons are traveling downward from the cerebral cortex because the cerebral cortex makes decisions and they have to communicate with neurons that are down lower in the central nervous system, like down in the spinal cord. Some of them crisscross, like over in here. They're crossing back and forth from one side of the brain to the other, from the left hemisphere over to the right hemisphere. But basically in those white colored areas, you don't have many cell bodies of neurons. Instead, you have lots and lots of these myelinated axons, this wiring between neurons in different locations of the nervous system. And so anywhere in the central nervous system where you have lots of myelinated axons and few cell bodies, you're going to have white matter. Now, if you look on there, if you look closely, like over here, especially on the diagram of the actual human brain, you get down into these deeper areas and you do have clusters of gray matter. So there are deeper areas where you do have some clusters of actual cell bodies of neurons, but a lot of that central area consists of white matter. I also want to draw your attention to, actually let me erase all of that. Let me draw your attention to, notice how you've got a white matter bridge on this coronal section that's connecting the left and the right hemispheres of the brain. And on this diagram from your textbook, they have drawn in a bunch of these greenish colored fibers there. That structure, and again you're seeing it in a 2D coronal section here, is called the corpus, come on pen, corpus callosum. And that is a white matter bridge between the left and the right hemisphere of the brain. All right, I actually brought visible body back up here because I want to show you where the corpus callosum is located on visible body. So we've got our brain back up here. I'm going to rotate it around. And notice if I'm looking down in here in the longitudinal fissure, I'm highlighting a structure. You can see a little bit of it there, sliver of blue. That is the corpus callosum. So down deep inside there, you've got this white matter structure, and it consists of these myelinated axons that are bridging neurons in the left hemisphere with neurons over in the right hemisphere, because you do have to have communication between the two sides of your brain. All right, so now we're going to move on. We've covered all of the major features of the cerebrum, and of course you're going to have a whole lot more function information over on the physiology side. Now let's move on to a deeper part of the brain called the diencephalon. So let me deselect my corpus callosum. We're going to take other looks at the corpus callosum as well as we go through the anatomy here. I'm going to highlight the different parts of the right cerebrum here. I'm going to try to hide that. All right, so I've hidden the right cerebrum. I've left the left cerebrum intact. And I have to caution you, this is where when you're trying to study some of these features and so forth in your textbook and you're looking strictly at 2D diagrams, it can become pretty confusing. So I just want to point that out to you. So keep in mind we are looking at the right side of the brain here. I've stripped off the cerebrum, so we're looking at some deeper structures. Cerebrum is still intact over here on this side. So you've got quite a number of different structures down here in this deeper portion of the brain, and a lot of these areas that are highlighted for you and colored in, they don't really have those colors, but those are areas deeper within the brain where you would find a lot of cell bodies of neurons. And so these areas where you have gray matter, cell bodies of neurons down deeper in the brain, they have particular functions. And some of these here on visible body you don't have to learn. I'm going to highlight for you the things that you do need to learn. And I also want to point out to you that apparently the brain anatomists don't always agree on some of these parts of the brain, so I'll try to point out some of those discrepancies to you, because if you are using visible body and you click on a structure, it may not have the exact same name as what I'm pointing out to you. So I just want to let you know that in advance. Okay, so where is the diencephalon? Now earlier, I'm going to highlight, well, I don't want to do that. Let me color in here for you. All right, so, and I'm going more with how your textbook is designating some of these borders and so forth. So everything that I'm highlighting here with the pen constitutes the brain stem. So we'll talk about that later. Above here, up in here, all of this area in here consists of the diencephalon. And the diencephalon has three major features that you need to be able to identify. The diencephalon looks like that, what you're seeing there on the screen, on both sides. So it has a left and a right side. That's where it gets the name 2. It has two heads deep inside the brain. It almost looks like the heads of golf clubs deep inside the brain there. So all that area is the diencephalon. And now some of the other things that you're seeing on here, like this structure, that is a structure that is part of the emotional areas of the brain. I'm talking a little bit about those over on the physiology side. You don't have to be able to identify that structure. If you're working with visible body, you can click on it and see the name of it, but those are parts of your emotional centers. The limbic system, that's the emotional area of the brain. All right, and let me erase all of those things. Okay. All right, I'm going to click on this so I can strip off some of the more superficial tissues there. Now, if you're using visible body, here's something that's different about visible body versus your textbook. It is calling this structure here, which is a main area of the diencephalon, right in there. And again, you have the same thing over here on this side as well. You just can't see it. It's calling this part of the brainstem, an area of the brainstem called the midbrain. Your textbook starts the midbrain down in here, and we'll be taking a look at the midbrain later. So I just want to make you aware of that. There are some differences in opinions among the brain anatomists about some of the borders here. So you just go by what I'm showing you. Let me hide that. So I've stripped off some superficial structures there, and we're going down deeper in here. And I'm going to kind of rotate this around. But do you see this oval structure right in there? That's called the thalamus. So that is a deeper structure that's part of the diencephalon. And inside there you've got cell bodies of neurons, and those cell bodies are involved in receiving incoming nerve impulses that are coming up from the spinal cord and the brain stem. And then the thalamus processes information and decides where it needs to relay that information up to the cerebrum. So it's kind of a routing station. So you have the cell bodies of neurons in here, and their axons extend upward. They radiate outward to different parts of the cerebrum. The thalamus helps decide where information needs to go. Now, what are some of these other colored structures that you see? Those are highlighting areas for you where you have cell bodies of neurons. Those areas have their own names. Most of them are areas involved in your emotional centers and are parts of the limbic system. You don't have to be able to identify all of those. So basically, if you see a structure like this that's in this part of the brain and it's highlighted for you and it kind of looks like an egg, that's the thalamus of the brain. So that's part of the diencephalon. I also want to, let me deselect that. Right in there, that's the corpus callosum. It's cut in half, but you're getting a different view of it there. Okay, and again, that's going to be a structure where you have lots of myelinated axons and they're crossing from one side of the left hemisphere over to the right hemisphere and vice versa. Okay, continuing on, I'm actually going to strip away some of those things we were looking at earlier, including the thalamus. Okay, so those have been stripped off. And so we're taking a lateral view deep inside the diencephalon. So another area of the diencephalon that's really important is called the hypothalamus. Oops. Okay, and the hypothalamus is, and again we're looking at a lateral view, brain cut open in half. Right in here, this area, colored in gray, right in there, that is called the hypothalamus. You're going to hear a lot about the hypothalamus when you take Biology 202. The reason for that is because you have neurons that are located in that area, and they are very intimately associated with the pituitary gland. Where's your pituitary gland? Your pituitary gland is right here. You might remember that from the very first part of the class. Okay, that's your pituitary gland right in there. Okay, so you want to be able to identify both of those structures. The hypothalamus is actually, as we're going to see shortly, you have a fluid-filled space right in here. It's filled with cerebrospinal fluid, and the hypothalamus actually has a left and a right side. If you can imagine this fluid-filled space being formed by my two hands, and I've got that little thin space in between, which would have cerebrospinal fluid in it, and down here around my fingers, there would be a left wall and a right wall of this fluid-filled space. So the neurons that are located within the left wall and the right wall are making up the hypothalamus structure. And the neurons that are in there play many different important roles in helping maintain your homeostasis. They're involved in emotions as well and they're involved in controlling the pituitary gland, as you're going to learn all about when you take Biology 202. And let me zoom in a little bit closer here on the hypothalamus and the pituitary gland. And so as I was saying, this area right in here is your hypothalamus. There's your pituitary. And another feature I want you guys to know, right in there you've got a stalk that's connecting the hypothalamus to the pituitary gland, and that is called the infundibulum. So you actually have a connection between the pituitary and the hypothalamus. I do want to caution you, if you're using visible body, if you click on this area, it's highlighting this whole area in here as the hypothalamus. And usually when you're looking at, where are the borders of the hypothalamus in a anatomy and physiology text, it's more like over in here, which I was drawing. So just keep that in mind. There may be some differences in opinions about where the borders of the hypothalamus are located. Not everything is understood about our brain. Some things are still being studied. You can kind of see, if you're looking at a lateral view, this almost looks like almost like a duck head, or kind of looks like a seahorse. So the hypothalamus right in here is like the nose of the seahorse, and the pituitary is almost like a button on the nose. I know you have to kind of use your imagination. And then right in here, that thing that looks like an eye, so your thalamus, you have a thalamus over on the left and you have a thalamus over on the right, and there is a connection between the two. So that little eye there is that connection, that bridge between the left lobe of the thalamus and the right lobe of the thalamus. That's what links those two things together. All right, the last feature on the diencephalon that you need to know, and I'm actually going to highlight some other parts of your limbic system, your emotional areas, since you don't have to be able to identify those. I'm going to hide that as well for right now. And let me rotate this around. So again, the brain's been cut in half over here, so you're only seeing halves of certain structures. There's the left half of the corpus callosum. I'm actually going to hide that. Well, that stripped off the left cerebrum there. But if we zoom in over here on the posterior side of the diencephalon, right there, you've got a structure, and that is called the pineal gland. A little tiny structure right in there. And that is a hormone-producing gland, and it makes melatonin, which is a hormone that is involved in your sleep and wake cycle. Some people take melatonin made by plants. There are some plants that make melatonin as well, and some people take that to help them with sleeping. So the pineal gland is this little bitty structure on the posterior side of the diencephalon, whereas the pituitary is over here on the anterior side. So try not to, there's your infundibulum that I just lit up right there. So try not to confuse those two particular structures. The pineal gland is part of an area of the diencephalon. It's also called the epithalamus, that's back here on the back portion of the diencephalon. All right, so I'm actually going to stop this particular video here, and we'll continue on with parts of the brain on the next anatomy video.